Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for showing up. And I'm not in the least bit surprised that our distinguished guest has drawn such a large audience. I'm in fact, really, he doesn't know this, but I've been an admirer of Maurice Bloch for quite a long time. And I remember when I was a doctoral student at Oxford, we had a small left-wing reading group. We used to discuss a book once a fortnight. And we had something on Marxism and anthropology by him and another by Maurice Godelier, right? So but my acquaintance with his work is really very old. He doesn't know me, but I've known him. And that stands to reason, of course. He's a much more famous person than I. But more important than that, the sorts of themes which he has always addressed and which he will be addressing today, these are really very interconnected themes, and they are very intimately related to the sorts of discussions that we initiated 2 weeks ago in the seminar, and that our students of religious studies have been involved with for quite some time. And I'm particularly glad that Professor Bloch, who is a fellow of the British Academy and is the emeritus professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics, spent his entire career, in fact, at the London School of Economics, that he has agreed to be with us, because I think that in these matters pertaining to religion, anthropology is of capital importance. And Maurice Bloch is, of course, an anthropologist, no matter how reluctant an anthropologist he might declare himself on occasion to be. He has undertaken field study, particularly in Madagascar, in various locations in Madagascar over the years. He has an interest in the confluence between anthropology and a variety of other social science disciplines, most particularly recently what has come to be known as the cognitive challenge, as it were, cognitive studies of religion. And he conjoins two kinds of analysis. He conjoins analysis which is objectivist, that is to say, which looks at social structures and social functions, with aspects of psychological anthropology, if I may use this clumsy term. He looks at the way in which ideologies operate. He looks at the way in which religions are constituted, and he wants to present to us a particular theory of the genesis of religion in an historical setting which is now 5,000 years old. Now, of course, this conjoins both objectivist studies of anthropological constants and the introduction of history into the field of anthropological studies, which to my mind is a very important thing to do. Because, of course, one theme that has come up in our discussions has been concerned with the definition of religion. Some scholars think that such a definition is absurd. Others believe that it is unnecessary. Others believe that it is not feasible, whereas others insist that it might actually be indicated and described as an anthropological constant or an elementary form, irrespective of what terminological convention one is using. He has been proposing that we introduce the notion of imagination into the workings, into the elaboration of a concept of religion which had been born at a particular time in human history, in conjunction with a time, that is to say, a time which also saw the emergence of large-scale polities, large-scale political institutions and political organisms. And in order for him to verify elements of that particular theory, of the imagination or of the transcendental, which he will explain to us, he proposes what one might describe as an experimental or a laboratory situation. A laboratory situation in which a society in Madagascar, which is in certain ways comparable to what we take earlier stages of humanity to have been, despite all the discussions that one might have about the relationship between time and space in anthropology, in order to discuss the relationship between religion, or to compare religion to forms of what is usually known as ancestor worship. This particular issue ties up with something else that we have discussed, and I need to indicate these for the benefit of those students of ours who are constantly coming to this, namely the question of approaches to the study of religion. We have gone over externalist, internalist, objectivist, phenomenological descriptions of religion. We have also, at one point, discussed the views of anthropologists such as Laidlaw in Cambridge, who maintained that religion cannot really be described, and that if there is to be any description, then it has to be a description of affective states undergone by religious personalities or religiously constituted selves, if I may use this particular vocabulary. Of course, to my mind, this is cognitively really quite nihilistic. It is, to my mind, a culturalist political posture which turns anthropological objects into conservation monuments rather than into objects of deliberate analytical study. So, of course, we come now full circle. We rejoin the very first points that I had made concerning the definition of religion. There is the question of definability. There is the question of identifiability of religious phenomena. There is the question of the historization of a notion of religion. This is, of course, altogether an extremely challenging and not an easy undertaking, and I wish Professor Bloch the very best of luck. And we're so grateful for him to have joined us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope you won't mind if I stand up, but that's because I'm long-sighted, so I can read my notes if they're at a certain distance. It's not that I'm feeling more professorial than I usually do. Thank you very much. And as you said, this is what I want to talk about today, is a part of a very general, ridiculously ambitious theory about phenomena that have sometimes been called religion. I'll try to outline it very quickly at the beginning of my talk. I might come back to it at the end. But the middle part will be looking at something much more detailed. So this very general theory, which I can't really explain, you just have to take it more or less as my sort of background, is the idea that anything that can be usefully called religion in English or in French is a historically highly specific phenomena that has only existed after the collapse of states. And in fact, it's a product of the collapse of states. Now, that places it in a very narrow period of human history, because states, after all, themselves are a very recent phenomena, probably not more than 7,000 years ago, and we know roughly that probably the earliest states we've got occurred in places like Egypt and the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent. So, in a sense, what I'm talking about is before these kinds of phenomena. Of course, there's states developing in China very similar sorts of time in South America rather later. But I'm really talking about a very, very early period, and I'm claiming, and I'm going to try to demonstrate this, that to use the term religion for what happened in these periods is misleading. I mean, obviously, there's no fixed sense to be attached to the meaning of a particular word. The question is whether it's useful to do so. What I want to argue is that it is not useful to do so because it takes us into misleading directions. So, talking about something which is, for most places in the world, very far back in time, presents a number of problems. I mean, there are fairly familiar problems which occur in such discussions, which, when we try to talk about what we think of as very distant periods, can be sort of characterized in two ways. One of them is to say, well, before whatever was religion, there was nothing, sort of chaos, rather like Hobbes sort of talks about chaos before the state, really basically what he means is there's nothing there. That seems to me quite misleading and totally unlikely, but the second problem is even more misleading and extremely common in the history of anthropology and especially in archaeology, is to see anything that might have occurred in the distant past as a precursor of what we're familiar with, a bit sort of saying, that the obelisks of ancient Egypt are early forms of the Eiffel Tower. Now, obviously, this is quite ridiculous, but that kind of thing is extremely common. And I'll come back to this particular point. I think one of the reasons why pre-state phenomena, which have been called religion, are just not this, and that we're getting into the kind of famous historical mistake of an ascending anachronism when we're doing this. So these are two of the dangers which I try to keep away from. And there's, of course, a third one, a much more obvious one. I'm talking about a period which, at least as far as most of Africa, but most of Europe, most of Asia, was very long ago, and for which we don't have much information. We only begin to get sort of the kind of information that I'm concerned with the coming of writing and with the coming of states. So how can one say anything about such a period? Well, it's very difficult. I mean, let's be honest. It's extremely difficult. But since my work concerns what happens before state formations occur in the history of mankind, of course that's the great, more than 95% of the history of mankind. So even though you might not know much about it, it's jolly important to think about what might have been occurring before there were states. One of the ways of doing this is to look at examples of places where the state has been not prominent, has been indeed more or less absent, often for reasons that the places we're talking about, contemporary places, are places where people have actually resisted for centuries the state. They're not really pre-state, they're anti-state places. And this is the sort of place that I've been working in Madagascar, in rather remote areas in the forest of Madagascar, where the people who I've been working with for the last 40 years or so have resisted a whole series of states, Malagasy states, bigger states which grew up in Madagascar as a result of weapons brought in by various groups, Arabs, Europeans, English and French, and so on. And they've carried on resisting the state the post-colonial state, the present state, basically by the technique of getting out of the way, living in places where state officials and administrators just don't really want to go. And so there is a sense in which the state is very, very little present. And since we have to make do with a bad job, I'll consider that sort of place, that village in Madagascar in the forest, as an example of what it's very likely things, at least in some very general ways, were like before the state. So the little village in somewhere lost in the forest of Madagascar is actually not lost when you're there. You realize it's the center of the world. But as far as people in towns are concerned, it really is a very lost sort of place. And I want to say only a very few things about this place, but only things which relate to the general topic of this seminar, and indeed of the whole lot of your seminars, as far as I can understand. And I want to sort of start with one of the most ordinary events which takes place in that village. Indeed, takes place inside the house where I tend to live fairly every morning after people have woken up, have tidied up the place a bit, after, removed bed coverings and places where people have slept, tidied the house up, because we've had breakfast as well. But the main reason why they want to tidy it up is because they know that they will receive visitors. Now, the people who live in that house are people who are by now a fairly elderly couple, often accompanied by a fairly elderly anthropologist, myself, and the elderly couple sits in the northern part of that house. There's only one room, really. Can I get something to draw with?
Of course.
So, a really simple view of that house. That's the northern. And they sit here. And the main door is here. And at the main door will appear a number of visitors. These visitors are the children of that older couple. They'll come in and and start very fixed, conventional little speeches, which are then answered by the older couple. Indeed, when I say speeches, it's a bit misleading, because the exchange that takes place between them is sung. It's actually extremely beautiful, sung very, very quietly. So the representative of the families of the younger people, because those are usually the only people who come, go through an elaborate greeting sequences, which, like all greeting sequences around the world, are fixed. And what I mean by fixed is that the words, the bodily positions which accompany their talk, is not seen as, and indeed is not, related to the intentionality of the individuals who perform this. What I mean by saying it's not related to their intentionality is that nobody imagines that they're thinking up what they're saying, nor that the older people will answer with words or bodily postures which come from them. The reason why they don't come from them, of course, is because they're following a pattern. They're deferring, if you like, to usually unspecified people who've been there in the past. They're, if you like, repeating others who they know behave in that sort of way in these morning greeting rituals. They're not just, I've used the word ritual because actually I would equate ritual with this kind of deferral. That is behavior which does not come, and which is not seen as coming from the intentionalities of the actor, but seen as the actor is following a pattern. Of course, they're following a pattern, but the people who they're following are assumed to be following others, and so on, into an endless regress into the past. So, putting it very simply, what goes on between them is totally predictable. It's totally uninformative also, since it's predictable. And it's also depersonalizes the people, in the sense that it's not them as individuals which explain the words that they use, either from the answers, either from either side, because that is what is said in that sort of situation. You can imagine the same kind of interchange is going on in all the houses. Well, all the houses with older people in the village in the morning. So they're greeting each other. They're sort of asking, hope they've had a good night and so on, that sort of thing. But there's more than that. The younger people are asking for a blessing. I use the word blessing, of course, a bit difficult, but a blessing for the day, for what's going to go on in the day. So they're asking for a blessing from the older generation. That blessing will be blessing them for the work that they're going to do, for its productivity, for its success. It also includes a blessing for fertility, so they will produce children who will carry on the descent line. Now I mention that because already as soon as you say that, you realize that evoked are other people than the people who are facing each other. You know, if you like, they're the future produced children behind the younger people who've come to ask for the blessing. And there are also people behind them, and hence the importance of the direction. Throughout Madagascar, but especially in this particular village, the north, or more or less the north, is associated with seniority, the seniority of previous generations, while the south is associated with juniority, if there's such a word, and the juniority of more junior generations. So they're establishing a relationship which slots in an evoked infinity of previous generations, because in giving their blessing to the younger ones, they're giving a blessing which it is known and which everybody will recognize, actually they even say so, which they've received previously from dead generations. So you see behind there all sorts of people behind there, all sorts of people behind there. So in that very simple act of morning visiting and asking for a blessing, all kinds of characters are evoked. But characters is not the right word, because of course it's not them as individuals. Remember, it's not their words, not their bodily features, but a whole sequence of generations coming on after each other. And if you like, there's a kind of flow of blessing going on, but it goes through the house and beyond. It actually comes through a little grilled window behind the older generations. So what these two people in this visit are doing in the morning is slotting themselves in through a whole continuation. Of course, it's quite, usually, and in this particular case, there are quite a few children households, although the greeting and blessing sequence only lasts about 6 or 7 minutes, since there are quite a few children in our household, it takes up most of the morning in the visiting coming along, asking for slotting in, I think is the right word for the flow. So it's very beautiful, and strongly beautiful, the situation of it sung very quietly, exchanges between juniors and seniors, which sort of echoes previous blessing giving and receiving giving at both ends. You see, the younger ones who come may well have themselves been previously in that situation of older ones to their children. So if you can get this large absence. If some of the children are not present in the village, well, or as they often aren't, it's understood that if they were there, they would be participating in that flow of blessing going through the house from north to south. And this is quite important because, in a sense, not only are those people behind there evoked, and those people behind there are evoked, there's a possibility of absent people who are sort of semi-present. If they were there in the village, they would come and do it. They would come and do it. I mean, after all, it's absolutely normal. But one of the striking things which is going on, as this is going on, is that lots of other linguistic exchanges are also taking place. And they're much more ordinary. You know, people are getting ready to go off to the field, to go and do a bit of... so there's sort of what one might call sort of normal, straightforward exchanges going on. And those are spoken in ordinary language with absolutely... I mean, it's not sung at all. There are no particular bodily positions. There's no fixed turn-taking as there is in all this sort of thing. So there's this sort of ordinary kind of exchange taking place for practical purposes. It's not clear who's talking to whom. Some people stay silent, and so on. And it's always quite amazing to me when I'm there in the morning is that the two conversations, the two types of exchanges can go on simultaneously. Even those people, you see, who are involved in these sung exchanges can join in the other discussions in using other forms of talking. So, and rather more loudly. It's very annoying if you're trying to record, as I'm often trying to do, the sung exchanges, because these other conversations and moving about and doing all sorts of things are going on. So I'm giving you this picture of what happens every morning. I mean, every morning, lots of time going on. Also to give you an idea of what I mean by those two terms I use of transactional and transcendental. They're sort of a bit pretentious, but I've sort of stuck with them now. And the sung exchanges which slot into that sequence of present and absent people, I would call transcendental. Why we would call them transcendental is because, in a sense, what is taking place in those exchanges is that as empirical people, they're absent in the sung exchanges. They're absent in the sense that they're not producing their words, they're not producing their bodily positions, they're not choosing who they interact with. They are deferring to others. They're deferring to the roles which they've taken up, and I would call, and I would think of that sequence that they're slotting in as a system of roles, which indeed I would say is the main characteristic. It's also it has also a very interesting relationship to time, if you think about it. The relationship of elders to juniors is antithetical to the ordinary flow of time. people, the relationship of this generation to that generation is fixed. It doesn't much matter what that lot think of this lot. They are in a hierarchical genealogical position. So the role is out of time, or at least out of the transactions of time, which are taking place in front of them as well at the same time. You know, there's double kind of thing going on. So that's why I would, you know, it transcends time. It transcends people. As people are singing to each other, if you like, everybody, including themselves, are sort of looking past the people who are present. They're looking past them and see them as children, parents. They're looking past them as individuals in relationship to each other. So that's the first image that is going on. And now I'd like to move to another image, which is very much linked with that. And that is, can I just get rid of this bit over? The village I'm talking about is situated on two hills, two double summits. And there's a river there, going onto the stream, and there's another place there. As one comes up the path, it's going up along here there, and one sees the houses are all here. And there's something almost obligatory. Well, not almost, actually obligatory, though nobody ever puts it in those words. As one comes up to the village, to stop on here, the sort of viewing place. One sits down, people always do that, and look onto the village. Now, what do they see? I would argue that if they're usual villages, they can see the village in two different ways. And so the ordinary villagers have these two available ways of seeing the village in front of them. They can see the village when you're not dealing with villagers who are accustomed to the place. When there's, for example, somebody who's an outsider who comes along, the people sitting there will be told at one moment always the same phrase. Actually, they use the word but, or at least a Malagasy word but. But we are one family, giving a sort of clear indication of the two ways of looking at the village. So what are these two ways? Well, one of them is you can look onto the village, you really see very much what's going on. You know, you see kids running around, the odd animal running around, people coming in and out of houses. It's pretty chaotic. All kinds of sort of activities going on that wouldn't surprise anybody. They'd also see lots of houses. And most of these houses are wooden houses. But there are a few which are not wooden houses. There's a sort of an unfinished Catholic church which a Catholic missionary tried to build, which is actually, it's over here more or less, but you can see it actually from there. He started a grand project, but it never was finished. There's also the Norwegian Development Agency has sent them a prefabricated school, which beautiful blue in sort of steel. It sort of came along and was sort of built. It's right in the middle of the village. It's because these big blue panels. And it looks somewhat out of place. It's even got a place for wheelchair access, which is really funny because there's no wheelchairs for miles around. But still, it's a proper Norwegian development agency of what a school should be like. So you see all this thing is slightly this kind of thing. But there's another way of looking at the village, which would be triggered for the outsider by saying, but we are one family. And you really do see it. What you see is that actually the houses which I've put like this, the wooden houses, are organized so that most cases, not all the time, the older houses, the houses of the more beautiful, the stronger houses are higher up, and then the ones of more junior generations are further down. So in many places you can see the line of houses, organized lines of houses. Some of the other children's houses will be further down. This, of course, will be following the north-south orientation which I was talking about. The young, as you may well guess, the more junior houses are further down, and to the south, the older ones are to the north. And so you begin to sort of see the village organized in that way. It's quite complicated to see it in that way because it is a bit chaotic, That is a kind of ideal organization. But there are rocks and things in the village, which means, that they're not sort of properly aligned in many cases. There are these houses which are not made of wood, and so on. There's the Norwegian school, there's the church, and so on. They just don't fit into that picture. I would say that actually what one is... on the other hand, there is something which is also ideally the case, and is very often the case, is that the older houses are more decorated, are more beautiful, are more wooden. The explanation is because it is a duty of the children, and especially of the sons-in-laws, to carry on after the house has been initiated, to carry on at various moments, to bring new logs, to make the houses harder. I'm using the word, the Malagasy word, make the houses harder, to decorate it so that the higher upper houses are normally more beautiful, more wooden, and so on. What I'm saying is that it's very similar to the situation that you have in the early morning that I was talking about. There are two ways of looking at the village. One way, which is paying attention to the kinship organization of the village, which basically organizes the whole village, because of course the older houses fit in together. And there's one way of just seeing it as a place where the kids are running around, where people are doing all sorts of things. There are sort of women hanging out there washing, collecting rain, which is what's going on most of the time. That very simple sentence, we're one family, is asking you to operate a switch between two different ways. And if you follow we are all one family, the whole village begins to be organized. Indeed, you begin to let me go back to the picture of the two hills. Most of the villagers will see immediately that actually there are two descents of houses on the two hills, with on the top of them two houses, which they're not empty, but they're seen as empty because they represent long dead members of the family. They're not empty because there are caretakers living in them. So you wouldn't see that when you just have a kind of non-familial kind of way. But if you think in terms of houses following each other more and more junior, they're empty at the top of it. And indeed they have a particular relationship in that they were those two houses were founded by two brothers-in-law therefore the women were exchanged between those two families, and this has continued, theoretically continued, so that the marriages of one half of the women of one half of the village marrying to this half and vice versa. So the more you understand the place, the more you think of her in terms of the one family, the more there is this, you're seeing a whole sequence of generations going far back to people who are long dead. And you can, I would argue, you also imagine the junior ones, because of course all this is following the line of blessing that I was talking place. You see, the blessings are coming down the hill, if you like, as well as they're going from north to south. So, with the switch occurred by the phrase, "we are one family," suddenly the place appears very different. You're asked, in many ways, to look past the village, in the same way as in the greetings, in the sung greetings. You're asked to look past a lot of what is going on to another system, but a very inclusive social system, because of course it links up in the end. You can imagine it linking up everybody in the whole village. You can imagine actually the rituals which create new houses, because these are also rituals of blessing. So if your son is creating a new house, then the ritual which established that house in that system of we are one family is a ritual of blessing which requires the blessing of the older people, blessing around the central post, as a matter of fact. So you see all this organised, going the whole village. Indeed, it can go beyond the whole area, because of course these people are related to others who can be imagined as fitting into this hierarchy of generations. So a whole very, very wide kind of an indefinite size of society. None of this is really very complicated. It's really actually all, it's very much linked with the notion of blessing. But it includes lots of people who are long dead, who are being asked, often by the intermediaries of the living, to give blessings. There are, grand blessings. They're being addressed as well. That would be called ancestor worship, if you like. They're also thought to punish people who misbehave in that well-organized kind of system. So one is tempted to say, well, there's religion there, if you like. There's a religious system. And one would be tempted to say that for very obvious reasons. You're getting blessings, you're getting prayers, where the junior ones are praying to the older ones are praying to their ancestors. One's getting even temples, if you like. You could call the empty houses on the top temples, if you like, because they're the significant people in the we're one family mode are all dead, although they will be addressed at certain moments when there's sort of quarrels in the village. People gather in those houses so that the system is there. And if you like to sort of use the kind of word, that Dan or Pascal Boyer would sort of use, one could say this is a counterintuitive system. Counterintuitive in one's very limited sense, strong in the sense that it is asking you to look past the empirical, the senses, into a system which has negated the flow of time and has negated the individuality of people. So in a sense, as one could call that, if you like, counterintuitive. I wouldn't use the word, since Dan is here, I use it. It's not quite that, but just to show to make clear my position being very different. So it's very tempting to say, well, look, what I've been talking about is, if you like, religion and non-religion. On the other hand, I think this would be selling what I'm talking about incredibly cheaply. Because notice many of the factors that I've been stressing when I've been discussing the We Are One Family system, I'm going to call it that, to indicate it. It actually is a system which organizes the village in the long term. Notice the groupings which occur in the morning, the ones which are created for people going out to the field, they have no permanence in any kind of way. They're there, the end, when the particular purpose of the action ends. While that system, while the one-man family system lasts irrespective of what individuals are doing. You see, I mean, people will complain if children don't behave in a proper way towards their parents, but that doesn't negate their relationship. They're just not following that particular system. Indeed, and this is extraordinarily powerful, the way you can see the village, you know, with the Norwegian school and the half-filled Catholic churches, and the fact that half the houses, not half actually, but almost a quarter now, are not these beautiful wooden houses. Some of them are a bit higgledy-piggledy. It's not anything, because there's a system which gives a kind of continuity in time. And it's a real continuity in time, which of course is very much linked with the fact that the people acting in this are not acting in themselves, but in terms of their role. Because it means, you know, that when one lot disappear or die, they can be replaced by others very smoothly through the system of ritual that is going on. So, if you like, the reason why I think it would be quite wrong to call it religion is that it underestimates the significance of it. It is the basis of the long-term life of that village, and indeed the base, and it is and it is also the basis of the fact that one can say, and people will have no problem in the village of saying, that that village is the continuation of what it was 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago. Because in a sense, within that We're One family system, the replacement has taken place. So I would go one step further in that direction and say that it would be selling it cheaply because it would ignore the extraordinary social and evolutionary significance of that system which I've called the We're One family system. If we compare, let us say, human social organization with that of any other primates, we see that what is totally absent in these other primates is that system which I've called the one family system in this particular case. And the fact that it is completely absent means that human society can be infinitely large. I use the word infinitely because you can slot in ever so many people. There's no limit to the number of people who might turn up, and then you fit them into the genealogy who can be slotted into the system. So human groups at that level of the one family system are infinitely, I'm using large, and indeed there are none of the problems on memory which the way sort of psychologists or philosophers tend to think of the social, because what they're talking about is what I've called the transactional. There's no problems of memory for this other system. You can get incredibly large systems, which seems to me a very clear break in terms of the evolutionary history of our species. And only through that system can you have that continuity which exists at that level over generation after generation. I would say that the social system of other primates is rather like the social system of people getting together, interacting with each other, reading each other's minds, if you like, which is going on in parallel with the song exchanges which are taking place in the morning, in parallel with what one can see from the hill, until you've been asked to switch with the phrase, "We're one family." So that's the basis, that's what I want to argue so far, and say that actually there's something going on which is of tremendous importance for understanding the social organization of this village, and which indeed may be indicative of the specific nature of the social of human beings as opposed to other animals. I would argue that there's a sharp break because of that possibility. We talked about imagination. It's complicated because, of course, is it in imagination, that system? Well, yes and no. At certain moments, it comes explicit, a certain what one would call ritual moment, in a very broad sense of ritual. The village is, in a sense, organized along those lines. You're just being asked to see the village, to see past the village, but in a sense, once one is, when you are being asked to look at it as one family, ones are being asked to see past the village. But once you've done that, it's being confirmed by how the village is. You've just forgotten about the bits which don't fit together. So one's dealing with a very important kind of system. So imagination, fine, because if by imagination one indicates that it has nothing to do with the short-term interactions most of the time between people, but it isn't something which is, first of all, is individual, because, of course, one of the interesting things which I've been working on is how that kind of system comes to be shared. Because, of course, to have the social effects that I'm talking about, it has to be shared. It can't be something in the heads of individuals. But I'm going to leave this aspect there, because I can see that I'm beginning to run out of time, and just to go back to what I was saying right at the beginning. In a sense, to say, well, what about religion? And before sort of trying to answer that question generally, I want to just think a little bit of the history, the recent history of our species. That is, let us say, the last 7,000 years. This is what I mean by the recent history. Of course, it is the recent history. Remember, we've been around for about 200,000 years. So it is talking about the recent history. And it seems to me that to understand what's been going on, there's one fact which all archaeologists would all agree about, is the growth of instituted states. As far as one can see, there was nothing like instituted states before 7,000 years ago. And so what does that mean? Well, how do states come about? I'm going to be just going over a tremendous amount of detail, obviously, if you're interested. But states come about through violence. They come about through one group of people conquering the others. You can imagine people conquering this kind of village and trying to impose their rule over it. Indeed, in another part of Madagascar where the state has developed, this is exactly what happened. It's almost the same kind of village. So the first stage is straightforward violence. And then states try to institutionalize their conquest. Again, one simple historical fact, which is very interesting, is that one of the characteristics of early states at the very early period is that the violence stops being kind of straightforward conquest violence, but become institutionalized violence. If one looks at, for example, early Egypt, the passage really pre-dynastic to very, very early dynastic Egypt, what is amazing is the number of people who were regularly being sacrificed. This was sort of archaeologists until very recently just didn't realize on the scale, but any kind of royal ritual, especially funerary ones, but probably others as well, involved tens of thousands of people being killed. Much, much more than was ever thought. We now can find the bodies. If you look at the same sort of thing going on in Mesopotamia, again, all recent work shows that this very early stage of state formation involves massive amount of what one might call religious institutionalized terror. Same thing's going on, for example, at South American states. It's one of the things that archaeologists can see is that they can find the remains of dead bodies. They can't, sometimes not very clear, but it's quite clear that we're dealing with a system of institutionalized sacrifices. And how does this come about? Well, I would say that what states do, and there's lots of historical information, is that they attempt to demolish or to destabilize what I have called the transcendental. This organization, which is very much this hierarchical organization, which I've been talking about, this organization of blessings, of kinship. The reason why a new state power wants to do this is obvious, because they're, of course, a political threat to the stability of states. And therefore they try to disrupt, especially the dispute settlement mechanism, which goes with that type of conquest. They want to disrupt it because they want, in the most classical of remarks about the nature of the political, they want a monopoly of power, they want a monopoly of dispute settlement. And therefore they see these systems as having something to be destroyed. Most states don't last all that long, so they don't get very far. They attempt to do this, but the longer they're going, the better they do it. Ancient Egypt is the most amazing case of great success in this demolition of the transcendental at the local level. I've tried to describe this going on for the part of Madagascar where you get the establishment of states. It seems to me that this centralization of this phenomena, which I've said is only misleadingly called religion, does not lead to religion in itself. It just leads to the kind of situations that we find, for example, in ancient Egypt, where the system which I was talking about, the blessing system, becomes the state system, linked with rituals of sacrifice, for example. It becomes the state takes it over, borrows bits and pieces, and creates a kind of wonderful wedding cake, which of course includes gods and invisible people. That's no problem, because of course they're already the invisible characters are there already in what I call the transcendental system. You know, you can include them. If you have a look at ancient Egypt, one of the striking things, something which fascinated Frankfurt, you know, the old writer on ancient Egypt, was that you see the Pharaoh having lunch endlessly with the various gods. There's no separation of this. So this is the next sort of historic, you know, I'm trying to historicize this very general theoretical position. And then, very quickly, because I just see I'm sort of running out of time, what happens when states break down? When states disappear? And this goes on, I mean, obviously states go on for a while, but then after a while they're chaotic. Well, their attempt at reuniting the transcendental within a single system actually stays there. It stays there partly for the reason of the success of demolition that states have gone in for. In a sense, it seems to me that they've demolished what I've talked about at the village level, the transcendental, the village level. But they just leave a kind of incompleteness. An incompleteness which, of course, one can see political, it's also in terms of individuals. Individuals are left incomplete by the breakdown of states. And so states continue as phantom states. Phantom states are all over Africa, for example. It used to be one of the most favoured discussions in the anthropology of Africa called sacred kinship. Sacred kinship were remains of disappeared states which carried on without the political system. And there are quite a lot of them all over the world, these kinds of things. And this is the moment, I think, when things which begin to be describable by, which are separate from the political, separate from the social, begin to occur. And of course, actually, what happens once they carry on in this sorts of way, these kinds of things that I would call religion, they're endlessly in competition with new states forming themselves. So the history of Europe is nothing but the history of a competition between religious systems which try to be states and states which try to be religious systems, but never managing to merge. One finds the same thing, for example, if you look, well, the Islamic world is a very good example of this, but you find this in India, where basically the process of state and then breaking down doesn't go so far, it never unifies, but it does go in certain areas. You find it, Thailand and so on. So that is when that very odd, peculiar system, which can be described by the word religion, in my view, appears.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, this is most suggestive. It is ultimately prodigiously synthetic. It is a fully fledged theory of religion. It does draw upon things that we already know, but it does put in a number of very new elements, which I'm sure many of those here would like to bring up, highlight, query, criticize, demolish, praise. Please, over to you. I have a number of things to say as well, but I shall keep those to the end, if I may. Please, over to you. Yes, please.
That's absolutely fascinating. All I want to do is ask, for my own interests, how you see Old Testament Israel fitting into the big, huge theoretical framework you've just given. pre-religion, or just want to ask you to...
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm sure you know much more about that, but one of the things which is often been mentioned about ancient Israel is that when sort of Judaism as a religion seems to have got formed, it got formed, of course, in Babylon. The prophets who basically began to create something that looks like a religion in modern terms seem to have been sort of, it's kind of memory of the previously destroyed kingdom in what is now Israel, the destruction of the temple and so on. Actually, it's rather explicit in sort of, if you look at some of the Old Testament books, like Isaiah, for example, that it's about a destroyed political system which had attempted to unite perfectly what I've called the transcendental and the transactional, but of course didn't get all that far because they got destroyed like all these other things, all these other states. So that's how I would answer it in this rather specific terms.
And is that religion, or...?
Well, it becomes religion when it's after the destruction. It's after a bit similar with Christianity. I mean, after all, Christianity comes after the 4th century of the Roman, 3rd century of the Roman Empire, the period of complete collapse of the Roman Empire. There's a bit of an effort to sort of put it together again. It doesn't last long. It seems to me to be very much to fit into that pattern as well. And so, one of the implications of what I'm saying is you're going to get religion or things which it is useful to call by the English term religion, which obviously is tied to a particular history of that term. It's never stopped changing, a particular history of Europe or wherever those terms occur. Those things, are not going to be found everywhere. The Abrahamic religions are a particularly good example. You get, as I say, other examples. For example, the kind of unification of what were sort of, state and Buddhism in certain parts still going on now. For example, Thailand, so on.
Just finally, do you have any thoughts on the monotheistic element of the Abrahamic? I mean, how that fits into some explanation of that phenomenon?
Well, I mean, the monotheistic aspect seems to be very much linked with the state. The states are endlessly trying to be monotheistic states and failing. But of course, I've sort of greatly simplified the matter in a way. What's going on in a state is a continual civil war. In fact, this is what's between a kind of resistance from groups who want to hold on to their transcendental, especially to their dispute settlement procedures, and the centralized power which wants to destroy them or at least to take it over. And this kind of conflict is never resolved. It's actually, I think, irresoluble. Because the longer these states last, and the more they are efficient, the better their side gets there. And then, when things go wrong, the civil war takes over. And I think this is when one would, So I would tend to think of monotheism in terms of that internal civil war going on in states.
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk. I will ask about something you only hinted at here, but which is more pronounced in the readings you suggested. This idea of deference, which is very central to what you identify as ritual. And I can see that what you're arguing here is for the stability of ritual through this process of endless deference. But I'm interested in asking how you would account for, let's say, resistance within a ritualistic community to said rituals. So where does deference fail?
That's a very good question. It seems to me that what I've been talking about is, I've been talking about ritual, is the push towards no change. Mm-hmm. But of course it fails in many cases. And it's much more difficult to, the situations are of course much more complicated than what I've been describing. You can get kind of recalling ancient, older systems to fight the particular present one. And that's something, Iran is a particular case. So there are different. The situation is going on after. You rarely get the sort of Egyptian situation, the kind of total monopoly of the state, with almost a near monopoly, but actually not really when you look at it closely, of the transcendental. Normally, there's all kinds of fights between different kinds of transcendental. So that's probably when the thing breaks down. It's less, I can't really, I would say when these systems break are at particular historical points. It's extremely difficult to generalize in the way that I've been talking about, which is extremely general.
Hello, please. No, you're number 2, if you don't mind. Hello, please. Yeah.
I have a question and a comment. I was a bit surprised by your response to Philip at the back in trying to apply your theory and view to the Israelite religion in that to that phase. I thought perhaps you would go further back to the time of the formation of the State of Israel, about which we know not that much, because even before the destruction of the temple, you had a temple, and you had rituals, and you had a god to whom people prayed and made sacrifices and so on. So I would say that, of course, the religion went a major transformation following the explosion to Babylon, but what existed earlier was certainly what I would, it's not personal, we would, and we do, identify as a religion. So I think that I was expecting you to apply your view to the earlier times of the formation of the State of Israel by the first kings. And I have a question also. In this village in Madagascar, are there any other practices which we would identify as religious or related to religion, like libations to all sorts of powers, sacrifices, interpretations of natural phenomena as being due to the powers of the personal, in some way, of entities?
Right, there are a number of points. I'm not an expert on ancient Israel, but I think, following from some of the people I've read, they're very unsure that you're getting something which in any way looks like what we would now call a religion before kinds of prophets like the prophets active in Babylon. It's very difficult to know. Of course, not dealing with one state, we're dealing with several before then. But also, another point I would make is that when you are beginning to get this unification of what I call the transcendental within a state, I would not call that religion. I mean, I don't think it makes any sense to talk about early Egypt, or, well, not just early Egypt, Egypt during dynastic Egypt, as having a religion. You can't, you just, this is again a point made by these older writers such as Frankfurt, is that you just can't, there is just no point in separating what you might call
Anachronistic?
Thanks. Religion and the political, they're just one thing. It seems to me that it's only when you begin to get the separation, which comes from the collapse of states, that you begin to get things which it might be just about reasonable to call religion. There are other things which we might like to call vaguely religious. I think, for example, in the Madagascar system, I think I won't go into it because it would be too difficult. But the dominant system is ancestor worship. I think there is a lot of reason for thinking that is the most common early form of things which might look a bit like religion but aren't. These pre-religious systems, this is what I've called the transcendental, are more complicated than they look, actually, because they're very much linked, I think, with age and generations, and the changes generations. And they're linked with rituals which often act out a kind of conquest of the young by the old, so that, sort of almost a kind of Nietzschean situation, if you like, so that the strength of the young can be used for the order of the old, and this is often acted out in rituals. But so that when you begin to look at it, it looks as though there are all sorts of conflicting factors, but actually they're pretty more unified than one would think.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I got a question about the importance of spatial aspect in your lecture in theory. You described the system of reference to the transcendental, which is very much attached to the special image, special representation of the world in which people live, if I get you right. And if I get you right, you see it as a crucial characteristic of humankind, like even which differs it from animals in some aspect, humans. And my question is about how crucial is this special aspect to this
spatial,
to space, to the geographic space, to the view of the village from outside. If you take, for instance, other forms of social organization, nomadic tribes, can they have other forms of this? You represented this without having a developed written tradition or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is particular to Madagascar, this particular spatial thing. It's particular to the whole of Southeast Asia, and to which the Madagascar are linked. Indeed, it's the significance given to space is a characteristic of actually a large number of Asian cultures, of which Madagascar is linked. It doesn't seem to be essential. That seems to be what is essential is the relationship of different generations in this, one of the ways in which it's expressed in this particular case. I'm talking, the pastoralists would have a different kind of spatial systems, but of course, there are lots of people who would argue that pastoralism is a kind of peripheral manifestations of centralized systems. But anyway, this is another discussion. So, I mean, basically, what I consider is probably key is the relationship of generations.
Yes, please.
Are there graveyards? I mean, are there places where people dead from previous generations are kept and visited. I mean, and the graves are visited or not.
You are talking about Madagascar, the question.
Yes, in the village that you gave us, on which you focused, I mean, are they the traces of the previous lives of previous generations? Is that matter?
Well, it's difficult to answer it very generally, but talking about a particular village, it's very striking actually compared to most of what we know in different parts of Madagascar, how unimportant graveyards are. And I think the reason is that in a sense the houses are the graveyards, if you like. What's going on, if you like, in these apical houses, which are, in terms of individual villages, is that they represent the original couple who pass on the blessing from to the lower generations. And so, for example, in the rituals in many of the rituals, it's a balanced one between food cooked on the hearth of the original woman who isn't there anymore, but then is eaten by everybody else, and the central post linked with the original man. So one can say that those houses, and this is true of all the houses actually, are, if you like, a kind of graveyard. The whole history of so that's what I would say in this particular case. I can't really answer very generally.
Right. For those who are worried about time, we're going to have one last question from the audience, and then I would ask you to allow me to ask one closing question, and then we'll break. Nadia, please.
And just for your usage of language that you refer to in the various scenes. So it seems that in the first case, in the house, language, the blessing, is a trigger for the ritualistic setting of connecting the present and the future with the past and the other part of the present. So this is apparently a language where the blessing is only a trigger for something to be aware of. But the other image you gave us where somebody said, but it is only family. That seems to be a higher level of using language here to analyze or to interpret or whatever the word would be there to explain the situation. So my question would be, are there different registers of language that are used by different people, or is this your approach to see how language is used? If you can say that.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I think I touched on that. Going back to the early morning greetings, one lot is sung. The words are not chosen by the individual person. The turn-taking is fixed in one lot, and this contrasts with the use of language in what I've called the transactional. Or I wouldn't say that this would be so everywhere. Though very rapidly, as soon as one begins to get a kind of difference in language, one moves towards intonation and singing like, even if you think of greetings, the intonation begins to change. So, I mean, it's very clear the different types of language being used in this particular case. Absolutely. And, of course, it's not different people who use different kinds of language. It's the same persons who use both.
Right. And of course, as you say quite correctly, the notion of religion has changed over time, right? From the time of the Reformation, of course, there was first of all a breakdown in the notion of truth versus falsehood into a more generic notion of religion, which encompasses quite a number of these religions, and this is a notion that you actually then find in Muslim traditions as well, very much earlier. And then, of course, so at that point, there was a tendency to define them in terms of specific doctrines. and particularly doctrines of theological import and sometimes of philosophical import. Come the 19th century, you had a turn towards functionalist interpretation or definitions of religion, which, of course, the Durkheimian of which the Durkheimian is the best example. And, of course, there was also the possibility of deploying a notion such as that of ideology in order to understand the functional aspects of religion. But throughout all of this, the phenomenon has generally been recognizable and fairly constant. So I think that the idea that the meanings of religion have changed over time and that we are in something which is conceptually or even as a phenomenon empirically indeterminate is very highly exaggerated, and I think it generally serves polemical purposes rather than cognitive ones of recognition. Now, if you were to concede this, if you were prepared to concede this, would you then explain to me why you would insist on denying the name religion to a phenomenon such as the system you explained, given that that system actually does contain quite a number of the distinctive features which one normally associate with religion, including minimally counterintuitive concepts, including a high degree of ritualization, of redundancy, that is to say, of ritualization. These are these morning encounters, and also bringing in actually action at a distance in terms of blessings, for instance, right? The transmission of blessings across the diagonal structure of the room, and of course across time, across the generation, from top to bottom. So why? I mean, is the denial designed to emphasize the specificity of this particular ethnographic laboratory situation, or is it rather a form of resistance to using the word religion, irrespective of the merits of the case?
Look, first of all, religion is a word which is, and I think I said in English at several places when I was talking about religion. One knows the history of the word. It's a fairly recent word in terms of what it evokes. Now, it's a fairly recent phenomenon. In English, I think the same would be true in French. So, and I would be very careful of not talking about the notion of religion as separate from the meaning of the word as it's been employed. So this is one first thing I'd like to say. I don't know, for example, in Arabic, I don't know what word would translate from
Deen, which is the exact equivalent.
Well, you see, I mean, for example, in some of the languages that I do know, for example, in Malagasy, there is no word there is a word you can translate as religion, but that is totally misleading. And that is the question of really my argument. My argument is, when is it misleading to use the word religion? And when is it helpful? I mean, obviously, we've got to use language, we've got to use the words which communicate between people. What I would argue is that to call the kind of phenomena that I've called the transcendental religion, call them by that English word, is misleading. That's really all I would like to say.
May I just follow this up with another comment, namely that, of course, when we identify a phenomenon as religion, just as we identify a phenomenon as economy or society, we're actually making an analytical distinction, right? We are constructing an analytical category. And analytical categories do not, to my mind at least, need to correspond to the categories of those to whom we ascribe religion, membership of society, or participation in any column.
Well, one of the problems of anthropology is that we tend to use words which are common words. We haven't invented a kind of meta-language for anthropology. It'd be nice if we had, but we don't. And therefore, the distinction between analytical and non-analytical in the practice of a talk like the one that I've used, or indeed in the practice of anthropology generally, is impossible. So let's just sort of muddle around as best we can. There are various things going on in this village. The only question that I would ask is, given what is understood by the people I'm talking to or the other anthropologists I'm talking to, is it misleading or not misleading to call it religion? I would argue that, the word, however these people, there's no anthropological definition of a religion, but if there was, it would be incomprehensible and I would be following it. So I wish one could have a meta-language for anthropology. I think it's impossible, and we don't.
On this note, I just thank you once again. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for the questions, for listening, for your participation, and thank you again for agreeing to come. Thank you.